good evening, and welcome back. If this is your first time here, know that you've found a place of rest, a quiet corner where history unfolds slowly, gently, like the turning of old pages in a room lit only by a single candle. Tonight, we journey to ancient Greece, to a moment suspended in time, when 300 warriors walked knowingly toward the end of all things. Get comfortable, let your breath slow, let the weight of the day slip away, and let me know, if you'd like, where in the world you're listening from tonight. Now, let us begin. The question hangs in the air, soft and persistent. Why did they march? Why did the Spartans, knowing what awaited them, put on their crimson cloaks, lift their shields, and walk steadily northward toward a narrow pass called Thermopylae, toward the waiting blades of an empire that stretched from the edges of India to the shores of the Aegean? It is a question that has no simple answer, and perhaps that is why it soothes us, because the answers lie deep, woven into the red soil of Laconia, stitched into the fabric of a culture so alien and yet so strangely comprehensible that it reaches across 25 centuries and touches something in us still. To understand why they marched toward certain death, we must first understand the place that shaped them, Laconia, a valley cradled by mountains, where the Eurotas River winds slowly through fields of olive and barley, where the summer heat presses down like a hand and the winters come sharp and clear. This was not Athens, with its philosophers and playwrights and painted pottery. This was Sparta, a city that built no monuments, wrote few words, and left behind almost nothing but the echo of its warriors' footsteps. The Spartans were farmers and soldiers, and they lived by a code so strict, so all-consuming, that every moment of their lives, from birth to death, was a preparation for war. The bedtime history of Sparta begins not with glory, but with survival. Centuries before the Persian Wars, the Spartans had conquered the neighboring region of Messenia, subjugating its people, and turning them into Helots, state-owned serfs, who worked the land while the Spartans trained for battle. But the Helots outnumbered their masters many times over, and the fear of revolt haunted Sparta like a shadow. Every Spartan boy grew up knowing that his purpose was not merely to fight foreign enemies, but to keep the Helots in check. To be so fearsome, so disciplined, so unbreakable, that rebellion would seem impossible. This fear, this constant vigilance, shaped everything. Imagine a warm afternoon in Sparta, in the years before the Persians came. The sun hangs low, casting long shadows across the Agoge training ground. Boys, 7 years old, have been taken from their mothers and brought here to begin their transformation. They wear simple tunics, their feet bare against the dusty earth. An older boy, perhaps 15, watches over them with a willow switch in his hand. The younger ones practice wrestling holds, their small bodies straining, their faces set in concentration. There is no laughter, there are no games. Everything is discipline. Everything is control. One boy stumbles, and the switch comes down across his shoulders, not cruelly, but firmly. He does not cry out. To cry out would be to show weakness, and weakness is the only true crime in Sparta. The boy steadies himself, returns to his stance, and continues. Around him, the other boys practice in silence, their breath steady, their movements deliberate. Above them, the mountains rise, purple in the fading light, and somewhere in the distance, a shepherd's flute plays a slow, mournful tune that drifts on the evening breeze. This is the ancient history sleep story of a culture built on austerity. The boys sleep on reed mats, eat plain barley porridge, and learn to endure cold, hunger, and pain without complaint. They are taught to steal food to supplement their meager rations, not because theft is honorable, but because cunning and resourcefulness are necessary for survival in war. If they are caught, they are beaten not for stealing, but for being clumsy enough to get caught. Everything is a lesson, everything is a test. As the boys grow older, the training intensifies. They learn the phalanx formation, that tight wall of shields and spears that made Greek hoplites the most feared infantry in the ancient world. They practice for hours under the sun, moving as one, their shields overlapping, their spears held at precisely the same angle. The phalanx is not a collection of individuals, it is a single organism, a bronze beast that breathes and moves with collective purpose. A man alone is nothing. A man in the phalanx is everything. The relaxing history of Sparta is also the history of music and poetry, though not in the way Athens understood such things. The Spartans sang as they marched old hymns to Apollo and Castor, slow and rhythmic, designed to keep the phalanx in step. They recited verses by Tartars, the poet who wrote of beautiful death in battle, of the glory that comes to the man who stands firm in the front rank and does not flee. These were not songs of individual heroism, but of collective duty, of the subordination of self to state, of the acceptance of death as the natural price of honor. At night, after training, the boys would gather around small fires, and the older youths would tell ancient tales of Heracles and Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver who had shaped Sparta's institutions. Lycurgus was said to have traveled to Delphi and received the blessing of Apollo for his laws that demanded equality among citizens, simplicity in living, and absolute obedience to the state. Whether Lycurgus ever truly existed, no one could say for certain, but his shadow lay over Sparta like a cloak, and every Spartan boy grew up knowing that he was the inheritor of something larger than himself, something that had endured for centuries and must endure for centuries more. The sleep meditation history of Sparta is a meditation on discipline. Picture a young man, now 20 years old, initiated into full citizenship, standing guard on a cold winter night. The stars are brilliant overhead, sharp and clear in the mountain air. He wears his red cloak wrapped tight around his shoulders, his spear resting against the ground beside him. Somewhere in the darkness, helots sleep in their huts, and he knows that they dream of freedom, that they wait for any sign of weakness. He shifts his weight, stamps his feet quietly to keep the blood flowing, and continues his watch. There is no one to see him, no one to praise him, but he does not falter. To falter would be to betray everything he has been taught, everything he is. This is the ancient civilization's asim of routine, of small repeated actions that build a life, the creak of leather armor, the quiet scrape of bronze on stone as a spear point is sharpened, the rustle of wind through olive trees, the distant bleating of sheep on the hillside, the low murmur of voices as older warriors gather to discuss strategy, their words measured, their tones calm. Everything moves slowly in Sparta. Everything is deliberate. There is no rush, because there is no escape from duty. Spartan men lived in barracks until the age of 30, even after marriage. They ate together in communal messes, sharing simple food, black broth made from pork, blood, and vinegar, barley bread, figs, cheese. A visiting dignitary from Ionia once tasted the black broth and declared it the worst thing he had ever eaten, to which a Spartan replied, "Of course it is. You have not earned it with our training. The food was not meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to sustain. Pleasure was suspect. Comfort was weakness. And yet, beneath the harshness, there was a strange kind of beauty, beauty of simplicity, of lives lived without pretense. A Spartan home was bare, furnished only with what was necessary. There were no elaborate frescoes, no imported luxuries, no gold or silver plate. A man's worth was measured not by his possessions, but by his courage, his discipline, his ability to stand firm when others would flee. This bedtime history is the history of a people who chose to strip away everything extraneous, everything soft, in pursuit of a single ideal, to be unconquerable. Women in Sparta occupied a unique position, unlike anywhere else in Greece. They were educated, owned property, and were expected to be physically strong so they could bear strong sons. While men were away at war or training, women managed estates, made economic decisions, and spoke their minds with a frankness that shocked visitors from other cities. A Spartan mother, handing her son his shield as he left for battle, would say simply, "With it or on it, return victorious, carrying your shield, or return dead, carried upon it." There was no third option. Imagine a young Spartan woman, 18 years old, standing in the courtyard of her home as dawn breaks over the mountains. She has just finished her morning exercises, running, wrestling, throwing the javelin. Her body is strong, her movements confident. She wears a simple tunic, her hair tied back, and in her eyes is the same quiet determination that marks her brothers and husband. She does not weep when the men leave for war. She does not beg them to stay safe. She expects them to do their duty as she does hers. This is the relaxing history of a society where gender roles were strict, but where women held a respect and autonomy rare in the ancient world. The years passed slowly in Sparta, marked not by great events, but by the steady rhythm of training, harvest, religious festivals, and the occasional skirmish with neighboring cities. The Spartans did not seek empire. They sought security, stability, the preservation of their way of life against a world that seemed always on the verge of chaos. They were conservative, suspicious of change, deeply religious, and convinced that their ancestors had discovered the one true way to live. And perhaps they had, for Sparta endured when other cities rose and fell, endured through plague and earthquake and the constant threat of Helot rebellion. But then, far to the east, something stirred. The Persian Empire, vast and powerful beyond imagination, was spreading westward. Under Cyrus the Great and his successors, the Persians had conquered Babylon, Egypt, and the Greek cities of Ionia along the coast of Asia Minor. Now, under King Darius, they turned their gaze across the Aegean, toward the fractious city-states of mainland Greece. In 490 BCE, a Persian fleet landed at Marathon, and the Athenians, almost alone, met them in battle and won a stunning victory. But everyone knew it was not over. The Persians would return, and next time they would come with an army so large that the earth itself would tremble beneath its march. The ancient history-sleep story of the Persian Wars begins with a dream of conquest. Darius died, and his son Xerxes ascended the throne, determined to complete his father's unfinished work. For years, Xerxes prepared. He gathered soldiers from every corner of his empire, Persians and Medes, Bactrians and Indians, Ethiopians and Thracians, men who spoke 100 languages and worshipped 1,000 gods. He built a bridge of boats across the Hellespont so his army could walk from Asia into Europe. He dug a canal through the peninsula of Athos to spare his fleet the dangerous passage around its cliffs. And when all was ready, he set forth with a host so immense that ancient historians claimed it numbered over 1,000,000 men, though the true figure was likely far smaller, but still overwhelming. Picture the Persian camp on a spring evening, somewhere in Thrace, as the army makes its way slowly westward. Tens of thousands of tents stretch across the plain, their colored fabrics glowing in the firelight. The smell of roasting meat and bread fills the air, along with the sounds of unfamiliar music, drums and flutes and stringed instruments playing melodies from distant lands. Soldiers sit in groups, speaking languages their neighbors cannot understand, united only by their service to the great king. Xerxes himself sits in a pavilion of silk and gold, surrounded by his advisors and generals, discussing the route ahead, the cities that will submit, the cities that will resist. The sleep meditation history of the Persian advance is a meditation on inevitability. Day after day, the army moves forward, crossing rivers, passing through mountain passes, receiving the submission of town after town. Most Greek cities, seeing the size of the Persian force, choose discretion over valor. They offer earth and water, the traditional symbols of submission, and the Persians move on, leaving them unharmed. Why fight when resistance is futile? Why die for pride when survival is possible? But not all Greeks were willing to submit. In Sparta, messengers arrived with news of the Persian advance, and the ephors, the 5 annually elected magistrates who held much of the real power in Spartacan, to discuss the threat. The message was clear. The Persians were coming, and they demanded earth and water from every Greek city. To give earth and water was to acknowledge Persian sovereignty, to become a subject people. To refuse was to invite annihilation. The bedtime history of Spartan decision-making is a history of consensus and tradition. The ephors consulted with the 2 kings. Sparta uniquely had 2 royal families, each providing a king who shared power. Leonidas, one of the kings, was in his 50s, a veteran of countless battles, a man who had trained in the Agoge and lived his entire life according to the Spartan code. He listened as the ephos debated, as arguments were made for caution, for delay, for waiting to see what Athens and the other cities would do. But in Leonidas's eyes, there was no real question. Sparta had never submitted to a foreign power. Sparta had never bowed. To begin now would be to betray everything, to render meaningless all the centuries of discipline and sacrifice. Imagine the Gerousia, the council of elders, meeting in a plain stone hall as evening falls. The men are old, their beards white, their bodies bent with age, but their eyes are still sharp, still watchful. They speak in turn, their voices measured, recounting precedent and prophecy, weighing honor against survival. Outside, the first stars appear, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barks, and the sound carries on the still air. The decision, when it comes, is not made with fanfare or grand speeches. It is made quietly, with nods and brief words, because that is the Spartan way. They will fight, they will not submit, and if necessary, they will die. But there was a complication. The Olympic Games were approaching, and during the Games, a sacred truce held sway across Greece. No Greek city could go to war during the Games, for to do so would offend Zeus himself. And simultaneously, Sparta was celebrating the Carnia, a religious festival honoring Apollo, during which military campaigns were forbidden. To march out in full force would violate sacred law, and the Spartans, for all their martial prowess, were deeply pious. They would not anger the gods, even to save Greece. So a compromise was reached. Leonidas would take a small advance force, just 300 Spartans, all men with living sons, so that their family lines would continue along with allied troops from other cities and march north to delay the Persians at a place where geography might compensate for lack of numbers. Once the festivals were over, the full Spartan army would follow. It was a calculated risk, a holding action, a way to honor both religious duty and the need to resist. Or perhaps, as some whispered, it was something else. Perhaps the oracle at Delphi had spoken, and her words had sealed the fate of Sparta's king. The ancient civilization's psalm of prophecy is the rustling of laurel leaves, the hiss of smoke rising from the tripod, the low murmur of the priestess as she breathes the sacred vapors and speaks the words of Apollo. The Delphic oracle was the most revered religious site in all of Greece, a place where mortals could glimpse the will of the gods, though the answers were often cryptic, wrapped in riddles and double meanings. Before the Persian invasion, the Spartans had sent envoys to Delphi to ask what would become of them, and the oracle had given a response that chilled the blood. Either your city will be sacked by the sons of Perseus, or Lacedaemon will mourn the death of a king of the line of Heracles, the sons of Perseus, the Persians. The choice was stark: lose the city or lose the king. And Leonidas was of the line of Heracles, the legendary hero from whom Sparta's royal families claimed descent. If the oracle spoke true, then his death might be the price of Sparta's survival. Did Leonidas believe this? Did he accept his fate with the calm certainty of a man who has trained his entire life to face death without flinching? We cannot know his inner thoughts, but we can imagine the weight of that knowledge, the quiet acceptance, the resolve to fulfill what prophecy demanded. The relaxing history of preparation is a history of small rituals. Leonidas chose his 300 carefully, selecting not the youngest or the strongest, but men in their prime, men with sons to carry on their names, men whose loss would be grieved but whose families would endure. He spoke with each of them privately, and each man understood what was being asked. There was no coercion, no appeal to glory or fame. There was only duty, and the knowledge that sometimes duty requires the ultimate sacrifice. Picture the morning they set out. The sun rises over the Taygetus mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and rose. The 300 stand in formation, their bronze armor polished, their red cloaks bright against the pale earth. Their shields bear the lambda, the Greek letter L for Lacedaemon, Sparta's ancient name. Their spears are 9 feet long, their swords short and stabbing, designed for close combat. They carry only what they need, no baggage train, no luxuries, just rations and weapons, and the unshakable conviction that they are doing what must be done. Families gather to see them off, but there are no tears, no dramatic farewells. A wife hands her husband his shield. A son, too young yet for battle, watches his father with wide eyes, memorizing his face. An older man, a veteran of past wars, clasps Leonidas's arm and speaks a few quiet words. Then the column moves out, their footsteps synchronized, their shields catching the morning light, and the sound of their marching fades slowly into the distance, swallowed by the hills. The bedtime history of the march north is a history of landscape. They passed through the farmlands of Laconia, where olive groves stretched in ordered rows, and shepherds paused to watch them pass. They crossed the mountains into Arcadia, where the air grew cooler and pine forests cloaked the slopes. They walked through Argos and Corinth, gathering allied contingents, Thespians, Thebans, soldiers from the small cities of central Greece, men who had also chosen to stand against the Persian tide. By the time they reached Thermopylae, the pass between mountain and sea, their numbers had swollen to perhaps 7,000, but the Spartans remained the core, the unbreakable center around which the others rallied. Thermopylae. The name means hot gates, named for the thermal springs that bubbled up from the earth, their warm waters mixing with the salt spray of the sea. The pass was narrow, in places only wide enough for a single cart to pass. On one side, sheer cliffs rose toward the sky. On the other, the sea crashed against rocky shores. It was the perfect place to make a stand, where numbers would mean nothing, where a small force of disciplined hoplites could hold back an army many times its size, at least for a time. Imagine arriving at Thermopylae on a summer afternoon. The sun is hot, the air thick with the smell of salt and sulfur from the springs. The cliffs are gray and barren, dotted here and there with scrub-brush and wildflowers. The sea is a deep blue, stretching away to the horizon, and somewhere out there, the Persian fleet is sailing south, paralleling the army's march along the coast. The Greeks set up camp at the narrowest point of the pass, building a low stone wall to further constrict the passage. They post sentries, assign watch rotations, and then they wait. The ancient history sleep story of waiting is a story of quiet moments. Days pass, the Persians are coming, but they have not yet arrived. The Greeks drill in the morning, practice their phalanx formations on the narrow ground. In the afternoon, they rest in whatever shade they can find, dozing on their cloaks, talking in low voices. Some of the younger men are nervous, their hands trembling as they check and recheck their equipment. The Spartans are calm. They have trained for this their entire lives. Fear is a luxury they cannot afford, and besides, they have already accepted what will come. To accept death is to be free of it. Leonidas walks among the men, speaking with them, his presence a steady reassurance. He is not a man of grand speeches or stirring rhetoric. His words are simple, practical. He checks armor, offers advice on stance and grip, reminds them that the phalanx is everything, that no man stands alone. At night, he sits by the fire with his captains, and they discuss strategy, fallback positions, how to rotate troops to keep men fresh, how to use the terrain to their advantage. The firelight flickers on their faces, casting shadows that dance and shift, and overhead the stars wheel slowly across the sky. The sleep meditation history of the stars is a meditation on eternity. The same constellations that shone over Thermopylae shine still, unchanged by the passage of 25 centuries. Orion the hunter, the Pleiades, the Great Bear circling the pole. The ancient Greeks saw in them the stories of their gods and heroes, and perhaps Leonidas, looking up, thought of Heracles, his distant ancestor, who had also faced impossible labors and completed them through strength and will. Or perhaps he thought of nothing at all, simply resting in the silence, gathering his strength for what was to come. Then, one morning, the scouts return with news. The Persians are here. The vanguard has reached the southern edge of the pass, and the main body is encamped a few miles back, stretching inland as far as the eye can see. Xerxes has arrived with his host, and the battle, long anticipated, is about to begin. The bedtime history of first contact is a history of stillness before the storm. The Greeks stand to arms, form their phalanx, and wait. Hours pass. The sun climbs higher, the heat grows oppressive, and still nothing happens. Xerxes, they learn later, spent those days waiting for the Greeks to lose their nerve and flee. Surely, he thought, once they saw the size of his army, they would realize the futility of resistance and scatter. But the Greeks did not move. They held their position day after day, and finally Xerxes' patience ran out. He sent emissaries to demand surrender. The emissaries approached under a flag of truce, their robes rich and colorful, their manner confident. They addressed Leonidas with courtesy, acknowledging his courage, but pointing out the obvious. The Persian army was vast, the Greek force tiny, resistance was pointless. If the Greeks laid down their arms, they would be treated well, perhaps even rewarded. All they had to do was step aside. Leonidas's response has echoed down through history, though the exact words vary in different accounts. Some say he simply said, "Come and take them." Others record longer exchanges. Debates about freedom and slavery, about the Greek way of life and the Persian system of absolute monarchy. But the essence was the same. The Greeks would not yield, they would fight. And if they died, they would die free. The ancient civilization's psalm of defiance is the quiet conviction in a man's voice, the firm set of his jaw, the way he plants his feet and refuses to be moved. It is not loud or theatrical. It is simply the refusal to compromise what cannot be compromised. The emissaries returned to Xerxes and reported, and the great king, for perhaps the first time, felt a flicker of doubt. These Greeks were not like other enemies he had faced. They did not calculate odds or weigh advantages. They stood on principle, and principle, he was beginning to realize, could be more dangerous than any weapon. The first assault came the next day. Xerxes sent forward his Median and Cysan troops, confident that sheer numbers would overwhelm the defenders. The relaxing history of battle is, strangely, a history of routine. The Persians advanced, waves of them, shouting and beating their weapons against their shields. They wore lighter armor than the Greeks, carried wicker shields, and fought as individuals, each man seeking personal glory. They were brave, certainly, but they were not prepared for what awaited them. The Greek phalanx stood unmoving at the wall, a solid line of bronze and iron. As the Persians came within range, the Greeks leveled their spears, and the front rank of Persians ran onto those spear points and died. Those behind pressed forward, and they too died, impaled or crushed in the press. The pass was so narrow that only a few dozen Persians could engage the Greeks at any one time, and in that confined space, discipline and armor counted for everything. The Greeks killed with mechanical efficiency, stabbing, shoving, holding the line. And when one man fell, another stepped forward to take his place. Imagine the sound, the crash of bronze on bronze, the screams of the wounded, the grunts of effort, the orders shouted by officers trying to maintain formation. Imagine the smell blood and sweat and the acrid temps of urine. For men in mortal terror often lose control of their bodies. Imagine the heat, the sun beating down, the weight of armor, the exhaustion that comes from holding a shield and thrusting a spear over and over until your arms burn and your legs shake. The Persians fell back, regrouped, and attacked again and again and again. Each time they met the same result. The Greeks rotated their front ranks, pulling tired men back and bringing fresh troops forward, a well-practiced maneuver that kept the line strong. By the end of the day, the ground before the wall was carpeted with Persian dead, and Xerxes, watching from a distance, was said to have leaped from his throne 3 times in agitation at the sight of his soldiers being slaughtered. The bedtime history of the first day's end is a history of exhaustion and grim satisfaction. The Greeks pulled back to their camp, tended their wounded, drank water, ate whatever food they could stomach. Some men were injured, but only a handful had been killed. The phalanx had held. They had proven that courage and discipline could stand against overwhelming numbers, at least in a place where geography fought on their side. Leonidas moved among them again, offering quiet words of encouragement. And when night fell, they slept the deep, dreamless sleep of men who have fought and survived. The second day was much the same. Xerxes sent forward his immortals, the elite Persian troops, 10,000 strong, so named because their numbers were always kept at exactly 10,000. Whenever one fell, another immediately took his place. These were the great king's finest soldiers, veterans of countless campaigns, and surely they would succeed where the Medes had failed. But the pass cared nothing for reputation. The immortals advanced, met the Greek phalanx, and died in the same narrow choke point. Their discipline was better, their equipment finer, but they were still fighting on ground that nullified their advantages. And by the end of the second day, they too had been repulsed, leaving more bodies piled in the bloody dust. The ancient history sleep story of stalemate is a story of time stretching and compressing. For the Greeks, each hour was an eternity, and yet the days blurred together. Attack, hold, rotate, rest. Attack, hold, rotate, rest. The rhythm became almost meditative, a brutal dance choreographed by necessity. For Xerxes' frustration mounted. His army was being held by a handful of Greeks in a miserable mountain pass. And every day he delayed. The news spread across Greece, inspiring others to resist. He needed a breakthrough, and he needed it soon. Then a local man approached the Persian camp, a Greek from the region, who knew the mountains intimately. His name was Ephialtes, and he brought Xerxes the information that would change everything. There was a path, a narrow mountain trail that wound up and around the cliffs and came down behind the Greek position. It was difficult, dangerous in places, but passable. A force could use it to outflank the defenders, to fall on them from behind while the main army attacked from the front. Xerxes rewarded Ephialtes richly and immediately dispatched his immortals to take the path under cover of darkness. The sleep meditation history of betrayal is a meditation on choices. Ephialtes is remembered as the ultimate traitor, the man who sold his people for Persian gold. But perhaps he told himself he was being practical, that the Greeks were doomed anyway. That by cooperating he was at least saving his own life and maybe sparing his village from destruction. Or perhaps he simply wanted wealth and did not care about the consequences. We cannot know his heart, but we know his name has been cursed for 2.5 millennia, a reminder that some choices echo beyond death. The immortals set out in the night, following Ephialtes along the mountain path. It was steep and treacherous, the footing uncertain, and they moved slowly, feeling their way in the darkness. The Greeks had posted sentries on the Phocian troops, allies from central Greece, but they were not Spartans, and they did not have the same iron discipline. When they heard the Persians approaching, they fell back to a defensible position rather than engaging immediately. This delay was enough. The immortals pushed past, and by dawn they were descending the far side of the pass, moving to encircle the Greeks. Imagine the moment when the sentries returned to the main Greek camp with the news. The sun is just rising, the sky turning from black to gray to pale blue. The men are waking, preparing for another day of battle, when the scouts arrive, breathless, and report that the Persians have found the path that they are coming around behind. In the camp, a stillness falls. Everyone understands what this means. they are trapped. The Persians will attack from both sides, and there will be no escape. The bedtime history of the final council is a history of hard decisions. Leonidas called together the leaders of the allied contingents. Some argued for immediate retreat. They could still withdraw before the Persians completed the encirclement, could fall back to a new position and continue the fight. And indeed, this made strategic sense. Why throw away lives in a last stand when they could regroup and fight another day? But Leonidas knew something the others perhaps did not fully grasp. The Spartans could not retreat. To retreat was to fail, and failure was unthinkable. Moreover, if the oracle was true, his death here might be the sacrifice that saved Sparta, that inspired Greece to continue the fight. So Leonidas made his decision. He dismissed the allies, told them to leave, to carry word of what had happened, and to continue the struggle. Most obeyed, filing out of the pass in the early morning light, grateful to be alive, but also perhaps ashamed, knowing they were leaving others to die. But not all left. The Thespians, a contingent of 700, refused to go. They would stay and fight beside the Spartans to the end. And the Thebans, though some later claimed they were held as hostages, also remained. The ancient civilization's Assam of the final morning is the sound of quiet preparation. The Spartans checked their equipment one last time, tightened straps, sharpened blades. They ate a small meal, though many had no appetite. They combed their hair, an old Spartan custom before battle, making themselves presentable for death. Leonidas walked among them, and his face was calm, almost serene. They were down to perhaps 1,400 men, and behind them the immortals were drawing closer, and ahead the full weight of the Persian army was massing for a final assault. The relaxing history of acceptance is the strange peace that comes when all choices are gone, when the path is clear even though it leads to darkness. The Spartans had spent their entire lives preparing for this moment, and now it had arrived, and there was a kind of relief in it. No more waiting, no more wondering, just the simple clarity of battle, the purity of purpose, the knowledge that they would do what they had always been trained to do: stand firm, hold the line, and never yield. The Persians attacked from both sides simultaneously. From the front, the main army surged forward, no longer cautious, knowing the Greeks were doomed. From behind, the immortals descended the mountain path and moved to close the trap. The Greeks formed a circle, their shields facing outward, and prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. The bedtime history of the last stand is a history told in fragments, pieced together from the accounts of those who survived, the allies who had retreated, the Persians who witnessed it, the later historians who interviewed them. The fighting was savage. The Greeks, knowing death was certain, fought with reckless courage, pushing forward out of the pass and into the wider ground beyond, killing scores of Persians before being forced back. Leonidas fell early, struck down in the thick of battle, and immediately a desperate fight broke out over his body. The Spartans drove the Persians back 4 times, trying to recover their king's corpse, but eventually they were overwhelmed and forced to retreat to a small hill within the pass. Picture that hill, a low mound of rock and earth, barely higher than a man. The Spartans climbed it, dragging their wounded, and formed a final circle. Their spears were broken now, snapped in the press of battle, and they drew their swords, those short, stabbing blades designed for close-quarter killing. The Persians surrounded them, shooting arrows from a distance, unwilling to close with men who even now were dangerous. The Greeks crouched behind their shields, and the arrows fell like rain, clattering against bronze, thudding into wood, finding the gaps in armor. The ancient history sleep story of the end is a story of silence descending. One by one, the Spartans fell. They did not cry out. They did not beg for mercy. They simply fought until they could fight no more, and then they died, slumping against their shields, their blood soaking into the dry earth. The sun climbed higher. The heat grew intense, and still the arrows fell. The Thespians died beside the Spartans, and their memory too should be honored, for they had no oracle binding them, no prophecy demanding their sacrifice. They stayed because they chose to, and that choice was perhaps even braver. When it was over, when the last Greek had fallen, the Persians moved cautiously up the hill to survey the carnage. The bodies lay in heaps, bristling with arrows, soaked in blood. Xerxes ordered a search for Leonidas's body, and when it was found, in a fury, he commanded that the Spartan king be beheaded and his body crucified. A shocking desecration by Greek standards, a sign of how deeply the resistance at Thermopylae had angered the great king. But anger could not erase what had happened. The Persians had lost thousands of men to kill a few hundred Greeks. They had been delayed for days, and in those days, the Greek cities to the south had time to prepare, to evacuate Athens, to gather their fleets at Salamis. The sacrifice at Thermopylae bought time, and in the calculus of war, time can be the most valuable commodity of all. The sleep meditation history of aftermath is a meditation on consequences that ripple outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. The Persian army moved on, marching south, and they burned Athens, as Xerxes had vowed to do. But at Salamis, in the narrow waters between the island and the mainland, the Greek fleet met the Persian fleet and won a stunning victory, destroying much of Xerxes's navy and forcing him to withdraw back to Asia, leaving behind an army that would be defeated the following year at Plataea. The Persian invasion failed. Greece remained free, and the Spartans, despite having sent only 300 to Thermopylae, had earned a reputation for valor that would echo across centuries. The bedtime history of memory is the history of how stories are told and retold, how deeds are transformed into legend, how 300 men become symbols of something larger than themselves. The Greeks erected a stone marker at Thermopylae, and on it they carved an epitaph, simple and stark. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie, not we fought bravely, or we won glory, but simply we obeyed, because that, in the end, was the answer to the question that began our story. Why did the Spartans march toward their certain death? Because their laws commanded it. Because their training prepared them for it. Because their entire culture, from the Agoge to the Gerousia, from the Helot fields to the barracks halls, was built on the principle that the individual exists to serve the state, that duty is higher than life, that honor is the only thing that survives death. The relaxing history of Sparta's legacy is a complex one, neither purely heroic nor purely tragic. The Spartans were not gentle people. They kept slaves, they exposed weak infants, they created a society that offered little room for art or philosophy, or the kind of individual flourishing that Athens celebrated. They were rigid, conservative, and often brutal. And yet, in that pass at Thermopylae, they did something remarkable. They showed that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate action. They showed that a small group of disciplined, committed individuals can stand against overwhelming odds. They showed that some things, freedom, honor, the right to live according to one's own laws, are worth dying for. For 2,500 years, the story of the 300 has inspired soldiers, poets, and painters. It has been told and retold, adapted and embellished, until it is sometimes hard to separate history from myth. But the core truth remains. In 480 BCE, at a narrow pass between mountain and sea, a small group of men chose death over submission, and in doing so, they changed the course of history. The ancient civilization's Assam of Thermopylae is the whisper of wind through the pass, the distant crash of waves, the crunch of gravel underfoot as you walk the ground where they stood. The hot gates are still there, though the coastline has shifted and the sea is farther away now than it was in ancient times. The thermal springs still bubble up, warm and sulphurous, and the cliffs still rise, gray and silent. If you stand there at dawn or dusk, when the light is soft and the tourists have gone, you can almost feel the presence of those ancient warriors, their ghosts standing watch, their shields locked, their spears ready, waiting for an enemy who will never come. Picture a modern traveler standing at Thermopylae on a quiet evening. The sun is setting, casting long shadows, and the memorial stands stark against the darkening sky. A bronze statue of Leonidas, helmeted and stern, his shield raised, his spear forever poised to strike. Below, the inscription in Greek, and around it, the landscape mostly unchanged, despite the passage of millennia. The traveler reads the epitaph, and perhaps thinks of all the other soldiers in all the other wars who have faced their own Thermopylae, their own narrow pass where duty demanded everything. The bedtime history of valor is not always the history of victory. Sometimes it is the history of noble failure, of standing firm, even when standing is futile, of doing what is right, not because it will succeed, but because it is right. The Spartans at Thermopylae did not save Greece by themselves. They did not defeat the Persian army. What they did was inspire others, show what was possible, demonstrate that even the mightiest empire could be resisted. And that inspiration, that example, was perhaps more powerful than any battlefield victory. Imagine the Greek cities receiving news of Thermopylae. Imagine the messengers arriving, dusty and exhausted, to report that Leonidas had fallen, that the 300 were dead, but that they had held for 3 days, had killed thousands of Persians, had refused to yield. Imagine the mixture of grief and pride, sorrow for the dead, and determination to honor their sacrifice by continuing the fight. At Salamis, when the Greek commanders debated whether to withdraw or stand, the memory of Thermopylae steadied them. If 300 Spartans could face the entire Persian army, then surely the combined Greek fleet could face the Persian navy. And so they stayed, and they fought, and they won. The ancient history sleep story of inspiration is a story about how courage breeds courage, how one act of defiance can light a fire that spreads far beyond its original source. The Spartans were not trying to be heroes in the modern sense, were not seeking fame or glory for its own sake. They were simply doing what their culture demanded, what their training prepared them for, what the oracle seemed to require. But in doing so, they created something that transcended their immediate situation, something that spoke to fundamental human values that cross cultures and centuries. The sleep meditation history of philosophy asks us to consider: what makes a life well lived? Is it pleasure, comfort, safety? Is it the accumulation of wealth and honors? Or is it something else, the sense of having lived according to a code, of having stood for something, of having faced the ultimate test and not been found wanting? The Spartans at Thermopylae had no illusions about what awaited them. They were not deluded or fanatical. They were clear-eyed and sober, and they chose death because the alternative, submission, surrender, the betrayal of everything they valued, was worse than death. In our own time, when physical courage is less often called upon, the example of Thermopylae still resonates because it speaks to the deeper question of moral courage. The courage to stand by one's principles when doing so is costly. To resist pressure, to conform, to accept loss rather than compromise what is essential. The Spartans were not asking anyone to admire their harshness or their militarism. They were simply showing, through action rather than words, that some things matter more than survival. The relaxing history of the Persian aftermath is a history of retreat and retrenchment. After Salamis, Xerxes returned to Persia, leaving his general Mardonius to continue the campaign. The following year, at Plataea, the Greeks won a decisive land battle, destroying the Persian army and effectively ending the threat of conquest. Persia remained a great power, but it would never again attempt to subjugate mainland Greece. The Greek city-states, despite their constant squabbling and occasional civil wars, had proven that free men fighting for their homes were more than a match for the conscript armies of despots. And what of Sparta? The city that sent 300 and lost a king gained something intangible but precious, a reputation. For centuries afterward, to be Spartan was to be synonymous with courage, discipline, and martial excellence. Other Greek cities might produce philosophers and playwrights, but Sparta produced warriors, and when danger threatened, it was to Sparta that Greece looked for leadership. The memory of Thermopylae became a cornerstone of Spartan identity, a story told to each new generation of boys entering the Agoge, a reminder of what was expected of them. The bedtime history of legacy is a history of how nations remember and forget. Sparta's power eventually waned, defeated by Thebes in the 4th century BCE, weakened by internal contradictions and a declining citizen population. Sparta faded from prominence and became little more than a tourist attraction by the time of the Roman Empire. But the memory of Thermopylae did not fade. It was preserved by historians like Herodotus and later writers, passed down through the ages, adapted and reinterpreted by each culture that encountered it. In the Roman era, the story of Thermopylae was told as an example of republican virtue, of citizens sacrificing for the common good. In the Renaissance, it was rediscovered along with other classical texts and held up as a model of civic duty. In modern times, it has been invoked by everyone from soldiers facing overwhelming odds to protesters standing against authoritarian regimes. The specifics change the exact nature of the threat, the identity of the defenders, but the core narrative remains: a small group, outmatched and outnumbered, choosing to stand rather than flee. The ancient civilization's asim of historical resonance is the way certain stories seem to vibrate at a frequency that human beings across time and space can hear. Thermopylae is one such story. It is not the only tale of courage or sacrifice. History is full of them, but it has a clarity and simplicity that makes it archetypal. 300 warriors, a narrow pass, an overwhelming enemy, a decision to stand, an honorable death. The elements are stark and powerful, and they combine to create a narrative that feels almost mythic, even though it is grounded in historical fact. Imagine a historian in late antiquity, perhaps in the 5th century CE, as the Western Roman Empire crumbles and barbarian tribes press at every border. He sits in a library, one of the few remaining, scrolling through old manuscripts, and he comes across Herodotus's account of Thermopylae. He reads the story, and perhaps he sees parallels to his own time, the sense of a world ending, of old certainties giving way, of brave men standing in the breach, knowing they cannot hold forever, but standing nonetheless. He copies the text carefully, preserving it for future generations, and in doing so, he ensures that the story survives the coming dark ages. The sleep meditation history of preservation is a meditation on the fragility and resilience of memory. So much has been lost, entire libraries burned, languages forgotten, cultures erased. The fact that we know the story of Thermopylae at all is a small miracle, the result of countless anonymous scribes and copyists who deemed the story worth preserving, who spent hours by candlelight transcribing old texts onto new vellum, passing the words from generation to generation like a torch in the darkness. And now the story comes to us, here, tonight, as you lie in the quiet of your room, the day's concerns receding, your breath slowing. The Spartans have been dead for 25 centuries. The Persian Empire is dust. The hot gates of Thermopylae are a peaceful tourist site, marked by monuments and plaques, and yet the story lives. It lives in the words we speak, in the images we conjure, in the values we honor or question. It lives because human beings, across all the vast gulfs of time and culture, recognize something essential in it, something that speaks to our deepest fears and highest aspirations. The bedtime history of human nature is a history of continuity beneath change. We live in a world that would be unrecognizable to the Spartans. Our technology, our politics, our social structures are entirely different, but the fundamental questions remain the same. How should we live? What is worth dying for? What does it mean to be courageous, to be honorable, to be free? The Spartans gave one answer to these questions, an answer shaped by their particular time and place, and we may not fully agree with it, may find much to criticize in their harsh and narrow way of life. But we cannot deny that they lived by their principles, that they faced the ultimate test and did not break. The relaxing history of the night draws us gently toward sleep. Outside your window, the world continues, cars passing, lights glowing, the quiet hum of modern life. But here in this space, we have traveled back to a simpler, starker time, when choices were clear, even if they were hard, when men measured their worth not by what they accumulated, but by what they were willing to sacrifice. It is restful, in a way, to contemplate that simplicities and compromises of contemporary existence, and spend a while in a world where virtue was defined by action, where words mattered less than deeds. Imagine yourself there, on the final night before the battle, sitting by a small fire with the other warriors. The flames flicker and dance, casting shadows on the rocks. Somewhere nearby, the sea breathes its eternal rhythm, in and out, the sound that has marked the passage of time since before humans walked the earth. You are tired, deeply tired, and yet there is a strange peace. Tomorrow will come what will come, but tonight you are here among brothers, and the stars above are the same stars that will shine long after you are gone. And there is a comfort in that continuity, that sense of being part of something larger and older than yourself. The ancient history sleep story of the eternal return is the idea that certain patterns repeat, that the struggles of one age echo in another, that human nature remains constant even as circumstances change. The Spartans at Thermopylae were not the first to face such a choice, and they would not be the last. But they faced it with a clarity and commitment that has made them exemplary. In the old sense of the word, an example, a pattern, a model. The sleep meditation history of rest is the history of letting go. The Spartans, in their final moments, let go of everything hope of survival, desire for recognition, attachment to life itself. They stood on that hill, arrows falling around them, and they accepted what was happening, embraced it even, because they had prepared for this their entire lives. And now the preparation was over, and only the reality remained. There is a lesson in that acceptance, a lesson about not struggling against the inevitable, but meeting it calmly, with open eyes. And now, as our story draws to its close, let us return to the question we began with. Why did they march? We have explored many answers: duty, honor, obedience to law, the prophecy of the oracle, the need to buy time for Greece, the Spartan way of life that made any other choice unthinkable. All of these are true, and yet perhaps the deepest answer is simpler still. They marched because they were Spartans, and Spartans did not run. It was as fundamental to their identity as breathing, as instinctive as a heartbeat. To ask a Spartan to flee before an enemy was to ask him to be something other than what he was, and that was the one thing they could not do. The bedtime history of identity is the history of who we choose to be when the choice is hard. The Spartans chose, and their choice echoed through history, became a story, became a legend, became this word spoken softly in the night, across an unimaginable gulf of years, from those ancient warriors to you, here, now, preparing for sleep. The hot gates stand empty now, washed by rain, warmed by sun, silent except for the wind and the sea. But in memory, in story, the 300 still stand, their shields locked, their spears ready forever, facing the dawn forever, choosing honor over life, forever showing that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand firm despite it. The relaxing history of Thermopylae is, in the end, a lullaby sung by time itself, a reminder that all things pass, that empires fall, that even the mightiest armies turn to dust, but that certain deeds, certain choices, certain moments of clarity and courage endure. They endure not because they were perfect, the Spartans were far from perfect, but because they were true. True to themselves, true to their values, true to the bitter end. As you drift now toward sleep, let the story settle around you like a cloak. Let the image of those distant warriors, standing in their narrow pass, remind you that you too have your own narrow passes to defend, your own choices to make, your own standards to uphold. And let the knowledge that they did not stand alone, that they had each other, their phalanx, their shared purpose, remind you that you too are not alone, that we are all connected across time by the simple fact of being human, of facing fear, of choosing how we will meet the challenges that come. The ancient civilization's asm of sleep approaching is the gradual softening of thought, the loosening of attention, the gentle slide from waking to dreaming. Your breath has slowed, your body has relaxed. The story is ending, as all stories must, but the peace it brings remains. The Spartans are at rest now, have been for 2,000 years, and soon you will join them in that universal rest that comes each night, that small death and rebirth, that journey into darkness and back into light. Good night.